Είμαι ο Γιώργος Μεταξώτης και μαζί με την Τατιάνα Γραμματικοπούλου είμαστε συντονιστές για τη σημερινή ομιλία. Συγκεκριμένα η Τατιάνα είναι πρόεδρος της ομάδας και εγώ είμαι υπεύθυνος των ευρωπαϊκών θεμάτων. Σας ευχαριστούμε λοιπόν πάρα πολύ όλους που είστε σήμερα εδώ και υποστηρίζετε το σημερινό εγχείρημα.
Σήμερα θα έχουμε, όπως είδατε, μία σειρά από ομιλίες για την φαρμακοβιομηχανία και θεωρήσαμε απαραίτητο να υπάρχει και μία ομιλία για την δυνατότητα να απασχοληθούν οι φαρμακοποιοί αλλά και από άλλους τομείς απόφοιτοι στον τομέα των εγκρίσεων, στα αριθμιστικά ζητήματα. Και μαζί μας σήμερα έχουμε την κυρία Ευγενία Μέγγου. Την ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ αρχικά που κατάφερε να είναι μαζί μας εδώ. Η κυρία Μέγγου είναι επαγγελματίας ρυθμιστικών υποθέσεων, έχει μία 25ετή πορεία και έχει λάβει και ηγετικές θέσεις στο χώρο, οπότε είναι το πλέον κατάλληλο άτομο να μας συμβουλεύσει, να μας δώσει κάποιες οδηγίες, να μας διαφωτίσει για τα καθήκοντα αυτού του ρόλου. Είναι κάτοχος μεταπτυχιακού διπλώματος στη Βιοχημική Φαρμακολογία από το Πανεπιστήμιο του Southampton, αν δεν το έχω πει σωστά, συγγνώμη, του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου και μέλος της TOPRA. TOPRA για τα αρχικά στέκεται The Organization of Professionals in Regulatory Affairs και επί του παρόντος είναι και μέλος του ΔΟΣΟΥ, του TOPRA.
Κυρία Μέγγου, μπορεί να ξεκινήσετε.
Καλημέρα σας. Τέλεια. Ωραία. Όπως είπε λοιπόν και ο Γιώργος και η Τατιάνα, ονομάζομαι Ευγενία Μέγγου. Καταρχάς θέλω να ευχαριστήσω την Τατιάνα και όλους εσάς που μου κάνατε την τιμή να με καλέσετε σε αυτή την πολύ σημαντική ημερίδα την οποία κάνετε για την καριέρα σας και για το τι μέλη γενέστε μετά την λήψη του πτυχίου σας. Και φυσικά θα μιλήσω για το χώρο των ρυθμιστικών υποθέσεων. Όπως είπε η Τατιάνα, έχω αρχίσει την επαγγελματική μου καριέρα το πιο πιθανό πριν πολλοί από εσάς γεννηθείτε. Το 1994 λοιπόν άρχισα την καριέρα μου στην Ελλάδα, ομολογώ να πω, και τότε μιλούσαμε για τμήματα εγκρίσεων φαρμάκων, registration, ενώ τώρα πλέον μιλάμε για regulatory affairs. Αυτό, ενώ περίμενα για να μπω εδώ στο Zoom, κοιτούσα το LinkedIn και μιλούσαμε με την Τατιάνα και είδα το εξής από τη Μισελ Ομπάμα, ένα απόφθεγμα, το οποίο έλεγε το εξής: Success isn't about how much money you make. It's about the difference you make in people's lives. Έτσι λέει λοιπόν η κυρία πρώην γυναίκα του Πρόεδρου της Αμερικής. Και έκανε resonate μαζί μου σήμερα, γιατί θεώρησα ότι γι' αυτό ακριβώς μου αρέσει ο χώρος, μου αρέσει το επάγγελμα το οποίο κάνω, μου αρέσει ο χώρος στον οποίο βρίσκομαι. Ελπίζω λοιπόν σήμερα να σας πω κάποια πράγματα, περιμένω τις ερωτήσεις σας αργότερα, τα οποία να σας βοηθήσουν να μάθετε κάποια περισσότερα για το χώρο της φαρμακοβιομηχανίας και ιδιαίτερα του Regulatory Affairs. Θα μιλήσω για τρία πράγματα σήμερα, λοιπόν. Μια εισαγωγή για τη φαρμακευτική ανάπτυξη, για το χώρο της φαρμακευτικής, για τις ρυθμιστικές υποθέσεις και μετά θα σας πω και λίγα λόγια για το TOPRA. Τι είναι το TOPRA? But I have to admit that my presentation will be in English, so I hope that will be okay for everybody. First off, a few words about pharmaceutical development. Now, I'm sure you all know that a discovery of a new medicine starts very often with a scientific hypothesis. So we know the biology of the disease, and we start with a scientific hypothesis on how to modify that disease. We develop a target, we select a target, we develop a potential chemical or biological that we believe may modify the disease or even cure it potentially. So it's a very stepwise approach. This slide focuses on research and development. So when we have selected a target, we have selected a molecule that we think may have a therapeutic effect, and we proceed with development. Now, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but obviously there's a chemical and pharmaceutical aspect which relates to the characterization of the molecule that we have and developing it and making the appropriate pharmaceutical form and determining how what will be the manufacturing process and how to scale up the manufacturing process, how to control it. But there are other aspects that need to happen and to occur in order to ensure that that molecule that we've selected is appropriate for use by us all. We need to look at the pharmacology, toxicology. A lot of the work that we do here in pharmacokinetics is called preclinical development, often in animals, as well as in vivo, as well as in vitro assays. And then once we have enough information preclinically to assure us that we won't harm or the potential for harming our patients is limited, then we can start with clinical trials. And I'm sure you're all aware that clinical development is often broken down in different phases, in phase 1, in phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. And phase 4 is just as important because it indicates that the development of a drug doesn't stop. The development of a medicine doesn't stop with when you have, right here, when you have the license of that particular product and the approval of that product and placing it on the market. So it is a very lengthy process. And of course, when it comes to the costs of the development of the drug and the time that it takes, is quite significant. The development process, what we call development, preclinical as well as clinical, as well as the manufacturing and scale-up process, is costly and very lengthy. And there is, of course, no guarantee of a clinical or commercial success. In the drug development, I'm talking here and I'm really discussing innovative medicine development. I'm not necessarily describing the development of a drug which may be a generic and has been around. So the journey that I was explaining earlier, the preclinical development, the clinical development, could take up to 15 years from discovery to market introduction. And that is, most people say 8 to 12 years, but it also depends on the country that one is located in, of when will that product be available in that particular market. Now, very interesting is that a successful outcome, especially on chemical compounds, successful outcome is envisaged to be 1 in 10,000 compounds. When we say 10,000 compounds, we're talking about the very basic discovery chemistry phase of development. Of the development process. So I don't know if we have the facility, but does anybody know what is the estimated cost of bringing a new medicine onto the market to the pharmaceutical industry, the pharmaceutical company that will take on such a cost? Does anybody know, or does anybody have any ideas? Anybody wants to raise? I don't know if we can see if anybody can raise their hands. Any ideas?
There is an answer, $1 billion.
Aha, very good. $1 billion. So the answer is the latest estimated, and there's a lot of discussion about how these amounts are estimated, but the answer is $2.5 billion. And there's additional costs and development costs that occur post-approval. So even when a drug is developed and onto the market, the costs for development does not stop. You know, it's estimated again about 312 million spent on post-approval development, on developing further indications, formulations, dosage strengths, etc. Now, this takes, it is just an indication. I'm not saying that this is the actual cost of a particular drug, but it is an indication of how lengthy this process is, how costly this is, and therefore, it leads us on to the next. I just wanted to put that framework of what is the pharmaceutical industry all about? How many different aspects are there in the pharmaceutical industry? And of course, as pharmacists, you are all very well equipped to participate in any number. Okay, my screen doesn't want to move anymore. Ah, there it is. In any number of areas. Now, my whole life and my whole career, I have worked in regulatory affairs. I particularly like and enjoy the strategic aspects, obviously, but there are a lot of tactical and operational aspects that are just as important in regulatory affairs. Now, I like this representation because I think that the red bit here, the red cog, represents regulatory affairs. There's a multitude of functions that need to come together in order for all that work that happens through those 10, 12 years of development to come together and to get a product onto the market. And to continue to be able to have that product on the market thereafter. So there are functions like preclinical and pharmacokinetics and pharmacology and manufacturing, supplying and how to supply and manufacture the product, clinical considerations, biostatistics, data management, quality assurance, pharmacovigilance, medical writing, medical affairs, marketing, market access, sales, finance. All of these functions are required in order to get a product on the market. And regulatory affairs needs to interact. And I feel, you know, might be a bit prejudiced and not entirely objective, but I feel that regulatory affairs has a central and integral function to play for the development and the commercialization of medicinal products. So we're sitting in the center and interacting with all of the different functions in order to get a new medicine to market. What are the regulatory principles, especially, and here I refer in particular to European legislation. The principles are similar in other parts of the world, but for example, in the US, we may be talking about potency and purity. In Europe, we talk about three main parameters when it comes to regulatory affairs and when it comes to how medicines are developed and regulated. First of all, quality. We need to ensure that the quality of the product is appropriate. It's fit for purpose. That if we have a parenteral, that it's sterile. We need to have it well characterized. We need to know how much of the active ingredient we have. We need to know that it is stable and how to store it. So the quality of the product is a key parameter when you're looking at the information and the data that one needs to produce in order to support that you have a product which has appropriate quality. Secondly, safety. We need to ensure that the products that we give our patients, and we have to remember that we all may ultimately be patients, they need to be safe. And safety is an aspect that at the beginning of the development of a product is primarily preclinical. But as the product develops, we also have clinical safety, human safety data that forms a fundamental part of the data package that would need to be created and developed and produced to support that a medicinal product is appropriate for placing it on the market. And efficacy, clearly. We need drugs that work. There's no point taking medicines if they don't work, if they're not fit for purpose. Now, quality, safety, and efficacy are parameters that in any kind of regulatory submissions that we make to the authorities, they are always addressed. Those are the three main parameters that we always need to produce data for and provide, and based upon which a decision is made whether a drug has what is called a positive benefit risk, and therefore can gain a license to be placed on the market. I have another bullet point here, which is about cost effectiveness and pricing and reimbursement. When I started out a few years ago now, we were talking, especially in Europe, but globally, I would say, in all the other big markets, we were always talking about quality, safety, and efficacy. Those were the scientific data, the scientific principles that were needed in order for a medicinal product to gain a license. In the meantime, cost effectiveness, pricing and reimbursement, and what is also called health technology assessment has become more and more prominent. And the lines are a bit blurred. When I started out, a lot of people didn't want, a lot of people in the regulatory profession didn't want to have anything to do with cost effectiveness, pricing and reimbursement. I feel it would be foolish nowadays not to consider those aspects. There's a function within companies, which is market access and health technology assessment, and they focus only on those submissions. But as regulatory, you'll remember also in the previous slide, it is essential that we also take that into account when we are preparing our dossiers and when we are providing our advice into the development aspects of the product. Now, I'm often asked, so what is it that you do? What is it that regulatory affairs does? These are the principles, okay, but what is it that you do? And the best example, the best analogy that I can use is a translator. So our job, my job as a regulatory professional, is to translate what? To translate the science about quality, the safety and efficacy to the regulators, because the regulators are the ones who are giving the license for the product, the license or the authorization to proceed with a clinical study. So my job is to translate the science to the regulators, but also, conversely, to translate the needs of the regulators, what the regulators need, what the legislation says, internally within the company to the scientists. As you saw from the previous slide, there are a multitude of different functions that come into play when we are discussing the kind of data that we need to create and to produce in order to ensure that we have a product that has the appropriate quality, safety, and efficacy. So our job as professionals in regulatory is to ensure that the expertise that lies within the company develops the drug, the company knows all the ins and outs of how it's manufactured, how it is controlled, the kind of preclinical and clinical testing that has been done. We need to therefore translate that to the regulators, who have the role to ensure that the companies are providing the necessary information and that follow the applicable procedures to ensure that the product that will ultimately be placed on the market is safe and it's efficacious and if it is of the appropriate quality. So again, I mentioned the regulators, right? I don't approve drugs. That's not my job as a regulatory professional working for the industry. My job is to provide all of that information to the regulatory authorities. So in Greece, of course, we have τον Εθνικό Οργανισμό Φαρμάκων. And I'm sure most people, irrespective if they are pharmacy students or not, are aware of FDA. How many of you are aware of, it would be nice to have a show of hands if we could, or, to see how many of you are aware of EMA, which is the European Medicines Agency, which resides in Netherlands. It used to reside in London, which is where I live, but not anymore because of Brexit. And then how about names such as MHRA, BfArM, PI, MEB, IFA, TGA? They're all acronyms. We have loads and loads of acronyms in regulatory affairs. They're all regulatory authorities of different countries. So MHRA is the British regulatory authority. BfArM and PI are German authorities. And interesting, in Germany, BfArM is responsible, let's say, for small molecules, where PI is responsible for biologics. MEB in Netherlands, IFA in Italy, TGA in Australia. Every country around the world obviously has its own drug organization, its own regulatory authority. Now, remember what I said earlier about the fourth pillar, the fourth hurdle of the principles that need to be, that form the basis of having a product on the market. And the fourth one was cost effectiveness, pricing and reimbursement. And in some cases, like IFA, for example, IFA plays a role not only in giving a license, but also in the pricing and reimbursement. But for some other companies, and for some other countries, apologies, these are separate entities. So you have NICE in England, you have GKV in Germany, you have a lot of other regional health technology assessment authorities. Often, these are also called regulatory authorities because they control for that particular country if a product will be allowed to be placed on the market, not from a licensing perspective, but from a pricing and reimbursement perspective. So there's two slightly different things. The majority of the work that I do focuses on licensing from those regulatory authorities. It doesn't focus on pricing or reimbursement. And just a couple of words more on the framework that we have to guide the development and to guide what it is that we as regulatory professionals need to provide to the regulatory authorities so that the regulatory authorities can then progress and review and assess and ultimately license product. So in the European Union, we have quite a complex framework of legislation and legislative pieces. So we have regulations of the European Union who are automatically have the validity of legislation in all the EU countries, yeah, as they are. So for example, one of the regulations established the European Medicines Agency, and that is an agency which is valid and competent to regulate medicines within the principles of that particular regulation throughout the whole of the EU. Then we have directives of the European Union, and the directives of the European Union get transposed into national legislation. So one of the principal pieces of legislation that laid the foundations of the legal text which guided and which governed pharmaceutical development and pharmaceutical licensing was Directive 65/65. Now, that directive is obsolete now, has been surpassed by a regulation. But that directive had to be transposed in the legislation of each and every country. Eventually, that directive, as I said, became a regulation. It was further augmented. At the moment, when it comes to clinical trials, we are still regulated by directive. And that directive has been transposed into national law in each one of the EU countries. We also have a regulation for clinical trials, which is now envisaged to become operational by the end of 2021. And the reason for that is because there is at the European Medicines Agency, there will be a portal that will be used to facilitate the interaction and the submission of relevant documentation. It has taken a bit longer than initially envisaged. So regulations, directives, a lot of legal texts, and of course, each and every country has its own national legislation. So the healthcare system and how medicines fit into the healthcare system of each and every country differs from one country to the next. A lot of what we do in regulatory affairs, and especially in roles which are regional or global, really focus on the regulations and the directives at the European level. Of course, it is always very important to have an understanding and to have the knowledge of the specific national legislation as well. So, lots of reading. You never stop reading when you are a regulatory professional. And there's also a lot of guidance that is issued by regulatory authorities, by OFF, EMA, and so forth. Now, similarly to, as I said, to the EU, there's a lot of, in every country in the world, the specific legislation. In the US, for example, you have different acts that are passed by the Congress, and then those acts get codified into the procedures that FDA uses in order to govern the procedures, as well as the data that would be required to be submitted in order to get a license. But there are also international organizations which look to harmonize and which look to prepare different guidance, mostly, for a lot of variety of different topics. And of course, I'm sure you all understand, if every different country asked for its own particular testing, in preclinical testing, let's say, slightly different from one to the next, that would be even costlier, and that would take even longer. So ICH is the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. It's a voluntary consortium that has come together. The main founding partners of that was Japan, Europe, and US. There's a lot of other members now, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, etc. And they come together to provide guidance and to issue guidance that will be universally accepted throughout the world, so that any testing that happens can all be to the same standard. So we have a lot of guidance from ICH. Then we have a lot of guidance from PICS, which is a similar scheme at an international level of pharmaceutical inspections, because the national drug agencies, the regulators, also have a remit, not only to license, but to inspect the pharmaceutical industry, to ensure that the pharmaceutical industry complies with the laws that are laid down and with the practices that have been laid down. At the same time, I put up, WHO. We've now all become very familiar with WHO, especially in the time of crisis like COVID, have a very significant role to play to issue guidance. You may be aware, I'm sure you're all aware, that WHO has a list of essential medicines that are required throughout the world. They carry out a lot of efforts to ensure that middle or low-income countries also have the support that they need and the quality of medicines that they need. At the same time, similar to what we do in Europe, where we cooperate together in the EU to harmonize our procedures and collaborate, in a similar way, there's the Asian countries. The ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, who come together on a variety of different topics, just like the EU does, but also in pharmaceuticals. And they provide a lot of different guidance, procedures on how to collaborate, how to get new and innovative medicines into those countries faster, and in similar timelines, let's say, to Europe or US. So the framework, the legal framework, guides a lot of what we do. And part of our role as regulatory professionals is to ensure that we understand the legal framework that we operate within. As I said, depending on the role, a lot of my roles and activities that I get involved in are global. So I need to have a global understanding as well as a regional, a country understanding of the specific requirements. And of course, it's also very important to understand that the legislation, the guidance that is issued, as well as the science, the data that we will produce, all that needs to be presented, and all that needs to also take account and always take account of the specific medical practice of each country. And medical practice from one country to the next is not the same at all, because it's not. Culturally, we're different, our diets are different, our needs are different. And therefore, the framework and the guidance is always very important. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that medical practice is also slightly different from one country to the next. So when you're having a global role, you need to understand a lot of the times we focus on the requirements of the US and of Europe. But when we're trying to take a medicine into a global market everywhere in the world, we need to take into account of the medical practices and of the local requirements for each one of the countries. Now, I particularly like this slide. I'm looking at the time. We had a bit of a delay, but I'll try and speed up. So this is a busy slide, but I like it because it shows very nicely, I think, that regulatory affairs really is not something that comes only when you come to license the drug or once the product is on the market, but really it's throughout the development. So throughout the development of the product, in R&D, during the clinical development, during submission and registration of the drug, getting the license. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm moving my mouse and it's moving the slide as well. During manufacturing and scale up and any issues or any changes that you need to do post licensing, the labeling. Labeling is hugely important in communicating to the patients as well as to the doctors. What does this drug do? How does it do it? What are the data that support? What are the warnings that are needed? What are the contraindications? And some of you may or may not be aware, but advertising and promotion is also regulated. Again, very different from country to country, but regulatory affairs has a role to play in advertising and promotion and distribution, in reimbursement, as I was saying earlier, as well as in post-market surveillance. And the role, therefore, of regulatory affairs isn't just here in submission and registration. it spans from inception up until the point that a particular product is removed from the market. There's a lot of different functions within a regulatory department. There's a lot of different activities that are required. And these touch upon trade issues, they touch upon crisis management, how to develop the regulatory profession and the regulatory professionals, regulatory strategy, hugely important, regulatory operations, due diligence, making sure that the data that you have meet the appropriate norms, negotiation and communication and risk management are key activities of what we do on a daily basis. So strategic planning and interfacing internally and externally with the different functions, externally with the regulators and other government bodies, is a key part of the regulatory profession. And I hope, as I write on the slide, this is taken from an article that was written in 2015 in the Regulatory Rapporteur, which is the magazine that TOPRA produces. There's a lot of different slides on what regulatory does, but I quite like this one because it does represent, I feel, that there are a variety of different roles and it never ends, and it is vast and varied, and it does depend on the particular company, the particular molecule that you work in, as to which areas you may be exposed to. You can see, therefore, that when you are a professional in regulatory affairs, you can work in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different functions, at a lot of different levels. Now, the next slide is about regulatory strategy. And, you know, of course, I have to admit that this is my favorite area of regulatory. Now, before I get into this, I would like, clearly, I mentioned earlier about the legislation, the framework, the guidance that exists. Clearly, there's a significant amount of procedures, of legislation, of forms, different kinds of forms, and processes and procedures that need to be followed in order to comply with the legislation, in order to provide all of that data that would be needed in order to get the relevant authorizations. Yes, there's a lot of processes. Yes, there's a lot of form filling. Yes, it is fundamental as you develop as a regulatory professional to have an understanding and to be excellent at those aspects. Those activities form the foundation of a regulatory professional's career. But regulatory affairs is not just about the process. It's not just about the procedure or the form filling. If we just remain at the process, I feel, or at the specific procedure, we miss the overall goal of why these procedures are in place. And they are in place ultimately for the safety of patients, for the safety of you and I. We want to make sure that we provide, that we have innovative medicines, that we are cured of different diseases, but those medicines are fit for purpose. They are quality medicines. They are safe. They are efficacious. So overall, the reason why we do all these, the reason of the procedures, of the processes that exist, of the application forms, etc., is the safety of each and every one of us. So keep that in mind. Now, regulatory strategy, as I said, is something that I'm very fond of. It's one of my favorite aspects of regulatory affairs, and it guides, it provides the input. A regulatory strategy, what is it? It's the input that we provide as regulatory professionals throughout the life cycle of a medicinal product, from the beginning when it's an idea, all the way through the preclinical development, clinical development, registration, and post-marketing. And we always have to start with the end in mind in regulatory strategy. You have to start with what is the desired labeling, what is the indication that we want, what are the characteristics of this product that we want to have, what is the most appropriate pharmaceutical dosage form that we want, for example. What are the pharmacokinetic characteristics that we would like to have? What are the clinical data that we need to produce to support the indications that we want? So we always start with the desired labeling. It's also very important when we provide regulatory strategy in our feedback. I should mention that regulatory strategy is not a static thing. It's not like somebody comes to me, they have an idea and they come to me and I write a regulatory strategy document and I give it to them and that's it. It's not static. It changes with more data that one produces. It changes with time. It changes with what is happening around us, right? Competitor intelligence, what everybody else is doing. So it's an evolving, it evolves as time goes on. Remember what I said, regulatory development of a new medicinal product could take any time between 8 to 12 years, sometimes even as long as 15 years. So throughout this time, the regulatory strategy changes and morphs. One needs to take into account critical scientific data issues. How do you resolve any issues that come up? What may be your fallback positions? One needs to look at the guidelines, both existing but also emerging guidelines. It never stops. What I said earlier, you never stop to read, you never stop to learn. You never stop to evolve as a scientist and as a professional. And this is why I said, why I love my job, part of why I love my job. You need to think about how you will further develop the drug in the future. You might have a first indication, you might have many other indications to come. The biggest blockbuster that has been for the last decade probably has been Humira, right, from AbbVie. Humira has 13, 14 different indications. They didn't get all of them at the beginning, but they continue to develop this drug for all these different indications. Key milestones. Remember I mentioned about procedures and specific processes that we have in asking advice, in passing from one phase to the next, be it from preclinical to clinical or from phase 1 to phase 2 and then phase 3 to registration. Even the filing strategy, what kind of strategy you are going to use for each country, what is the legal basis, all these aspects you have to take into account, and in order to be able to provide the regulatory strategy, in order to be able as the regulatory professional, to translate all this into what the company needs to progress and to get the data that they need in order to ultimately discuss with the regulators, submit to the regulators, and get your product approved and on the market to save people's lives. So this is my last slide there we go. My last slide before we go into TOPRA, about the key skills that I feel are required for regulatory affairs. And of course, I haven't even put it there. It's clear that with so much scientific data, having a science background is fundamental. So I have come across people in the regulatory profession who don't necessarily have a scientific background. Those are very few and far in between, and mostly may focus on operations, regulatory operations. In most cases, biologists, pharmacists, chemists, medics, doctors will be the people that will be your co-workers, will be in veterinarians, in regulatory affairs, in the profession. And obviously, the first key skill is you need to know regulatory, you need to know the legal framework, you need to know the specific guidance, for the specific job that you are working in. But most importantly, I think, are some of the other skills, and a lot of the times called soft skills. And I would really urge you to develop those as early on in your career as you can. Obviously, critical thinking, you're all university students, you're all pharmacists. I'm sure you've developed critical thinking and data analytics. Data analytics, needless to say, in this generation of how important data analytics is and technology, the advance of artificial intelligence as well as real world data is changing the landscape as we speak, hugely. And data analytics is a key skill in how we develop, as well as artificial intelligence, in my opinion, as we develop the medicines and healthcare of the future. Communication skills. Needless to say, both verbal and written communication skills are key. You need to communicate. Remember what I said about translating. You need to communicate at a lot of different levels with a lot of different audiences clearly, and not say as much as I've said in this presentation. I'm trying to become better at it. You need to have attention to detail. You need to pay attention to detail. As a regulatory professional, it is a key skill and a key requirement in being successful. Clearly, with all the different aspects that I talked about earlier, clearly strong organizational skills and strong project management skills are going to come into play. Strong negotiation skills. If you're negotiating a strategy with your colleagues from manufacturing, with your CEO, or with the regulators, you really need to have strong negotiation skills. Often, and naively, when I started out in my career, I thought that the only thing that mattered is the science, and I only cared about the science. We live, and I hope I've explained the central role that regulatory affairs plays. And therefore, we need to have an understanding of the business context that we are within. and the business needs in order to support the viability of the medicines and of the companies that we work within. Of course, I put computer skills at the end of the key skills. It goes without saying that computer skills are fundamental to everything we do. However, leaving, as a last point, the key skill in being a successful regulatory professional, I think, is the mindset. It's the growth mindset. This is the single most important aspect that will make you a successful regulatory professional, probably successful professional anyway in any industry. So a growth mindset where you challenge yourselves constantly to find a better way of doing things, to being more efficient, to embrace the challenges that you're going to face, because there are going to be plenty and you will overcome them, to understand that mistakes are made and that they are opportunities for learning, to proactively seek expert sources and incorporate the learnings from others into your own development plan, and to learn from and celebrate from the successes of your peers, and actually to be a lifelong student. So if you thought that, if it's one piece of advice I could give you, if I may, would be to have a growth mindset, and which implies and which requires to be a lifelong student, which I find incredibly interesting and challenging and engaging. So this is all I can wish for you. Now, a few words about TOPRA. It will be a little bit faster. I know that we've taken a little bit longer than expected, but I hope that this was useful. So TOPRA is the organization of professionals in regulatory affairs. It is an inclusive, member-led, non-profit, global community. So it is global. It is committed to the professional and personal development of its members, raising the profile of the healthcare regulatory practice wherever it takes place. So we have members who are in the industry, in the generic industry, innovative industry, veterinary, medical devices, but also regulators. So it is a very varied organization, a global community. The vision of TOPRA, as I said, is to be the leading global organization for professionals in healthcare regulatory affairs. Our mission is to represent and promote the profession. And to do this, we do provide, I feel, exceptional support, world-class education, definitive accreditation, and we celebrate excellence in regulatory practice for all regulatory professionals. There's a variety of reasons why one should join TOPRA. I joined TOPRA probably about 20 years ago. At that time, it wasn't TOPRA, it was BIRA, which was the British Institute of Regulatory Affairs in Britain. And it was also, there was ESRA as well, the European Society of Regulatory Affairs. They merged and created TOPRA. Our remit is global, as I said. I have the honor to be a member of the board of directors for TOPRA for 2020 and 2021. Most of what we do as board members is all of what we do is volunteer work. And a lot of what TOPRA does is based on the work that the volunteers do. So it is a vibrant global regulatory community, and it is incredibly supportive to belong to such a community. We can engage and share and learn with our peers. We can develop our professional competence. We can advance our career. We can contribute to the development and recognition of the profession globally. And we can contribute to others having the opportunity to listen to our experiences and to share our experiences. It provides access to authoritative information and high quality learning opportunities. Utilizing the TOPRA resources, one can refresh your knowledge of the latest regulatory development. I hope I've indicated how vast the scope of regulatory affairs is. And no, I don't know it all. Even after, 26 years, there's still more to learn, and I never stop learning. And of course, there are preferential rates for TOPRA members for the various TOPRA offerings. As you develop your career, your regulatory path, TOPRA is there with different kinds and different levels of offerings and courses from your early stages when you explore the profession and establish yourself in the profession, as you move forward to consolidate your learnings and drive the regulatory strategy for your organization, and ultimately as regulatory leaders to influence the discussion on a global stage across regulatory professionals. Now, a couple of upcoming courses. The information is all on the TOPRA website. This is not a sales pitch, so feel free to go and look at what the courses are, how much they cost, when they are. Just to mention that there are some introductory courses coming up in November. We just this week finished our annual symposium. We have it every year around October time in a variety of different places. This year it was supposed to be in Brussels, but due to COVID, it went online and it was all virtual, and it was an amazing opportunity amazing interaction for a lot of people to join and discuss and converse and collaborate in a virtual environment. Next year it will be in Prague. Hopefully we can all be there in person. And last but not least, I just wanted to provide this slide which provides some information about different levels of postgraduate education that one could have. So there's a master's in regulatory affairs, there's PhD offering, if one wishes, postgraduate diploma and certificates, as well as apprenticeships that one can receive through TOPRA. And with that, I appreciate that it took a little bit longer.